I'm going to introduce Hugh now, our speaker. I want to contextualize what Hugh's going to talk about in the bigger picture. And I'm going to do this as briefly as possible, just to help you to understand the significance of this whole thing, okay? So the big picture is roughly as follows. Hugh's going to talk about multiple rocket launches, and he's going to talk about some specific operations, and I don't want to steal his thunder, but the significance is that South Africa didn't have this capability when we went into Operation Savannah in 1975. So we were outgunned. We used South African artillery that last saw action at the Battle of El Alamein, and we used Bedford vehicles, and we had terrible vehicles during Savannah. So Savannah saw a lot of changes happening, and one of them was we came up against BM-21s, and we realized the significance of these MRLs. And I'll let him talk about that. But the other important thing that happened was, besides the fact that we were starting to develop vehicles, one of them was a Unimog, early troop carriers in Angola, in Savannah, were the Unimogs with sandbags in them, and they were clearly inadequate. So that rapidly gave rise to the Biffle, and the Biffle became an armored troop carrier. But on the same platform, the same Biffle platform, the Valkyries came out, if I'm not mistaken. So you got that parallel sort of process of vehicle development for multiple purposes. And then it gets more interesting, because the specific operations that he's going to talk about now, you start seeing a transition, and you start seeing dynamics taking place, specifically about the integration of the artillery and other units into a battalion level, and he will talk about that. But more importantly, this one particular Operation Askari, was a really, really important operation from a strategic perspective, because that was the transition from an unconventional to a conventional war footing. So the final big battles, Modular, Hooper, Packer, those were all conventional wars. And the significance being that in a relatively short space of time, the SADF developed the capacity to upscale, not only upscale from a battalion up to a brigade level, which they did, but they also managed to integrate these weapons into battalions. And if you look at the armored fighting vehicle, the first Ratel ZT3, what is it? The Ratel that fired those rockets, that was put into action for the first time in that period of time. So in other words, you see all of these developments taking place. And with that, I'm going to welcome Hugh now up to the podium. Hugh comes from Natal, Newcastle, and I'm also a Natal boy, so that's where we started our conversation. And Hugh's commanding officer was a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, one of the really, really big thinkers in the artillery world. So I welcome you here tonight.
Just a quick service overview. So I started my national service in 1982, 14 Field Potchefstroom, and I was called up into 143 Battery. I completed my final camp in 1988 at Quito Quanavali as a sergeant, and then concluded my operational commitments shortly afterwards as a staff sergeant with 19 Rocket Regiment. During 1983, my first year, 143 Battery relocated to Middelburg to provide support for 4 Artillery Regiment and 10 Artillery Brigade. Tony mentioned this integration into these battalion fighting groups, and it added to the expanded artillery structure of the Defence Force. My operational duties, my first opportunity or occasion, misfortune, whichever way you'd like to look at it, of going up into Angola was Operation Dolphin, and that was in June of 1983. We were deployed on Jiva and Zenkongo, and we had the G2s, so the old 140mm guns, and it was part of 6-1 Mechanised Battalion Group. And really we just provided long-range fire support during the counterinsurgency and the interdiction operations. Operation Askari, which I'm going to talk quite a bit about tonight, because that's really where the Valkyrie came to the fore in a big way. So I was by this stage employed on the multiple rocket launches, and as Tony alluded to, we participated in one of the largest mid-war offensives into southern Angola. After Askari, and after my national service, I spent quite a few. I think I went up to Lata Army Battle School on 4 occasions from 84 to 88. And really we were honing in the skills and the operating doctrine of the rocket launchers. And we were looking at the whole force preparation and the operational readiness that was used later on for modular hooper and packer. And at this time, I also trained up as a troop post officer. And then my final engagement was Operation Packer, which was based up in Camaraderie. We had sort of shifted from the west more over towards the eastern part of southern Angola. And again, I was employed in the MRL operations, and this really was during the final major engagements of the conflict. That deployment was part of this, the artillery effort supporting the broader maneuver in and around Camaraderie. Just a quick brag, that's a makeup of Private Fred Trivet. He was part of Manchester Regiment, my grandfather, and for those of you who know the medals, you'll see on the very left-hand side, is the military medal. That fine-looking gentleman is my father, Lieutenant Fred Trivet. He was, unfortunately not a gunner. He was part of the Air Force as well with 21 Squadron, and he was deployed both in North Africa and North Italy. So really, tonight's discussion focuses on the development and the operational employment of the Valkiri 127mm rocket launcher. Just quickly, my time in Angola, along with subsequent periods at Lata Army Battle School, gave me first-hand exposure to the evolving tactics and the doctrine surrounding the MRLs and the way that doctrine developed over multiple operations. Unfortunately, during Askari, we had a horrible incident that occurred. 2 rockets actually initiated in the tubes of a rocket launcher. Both rockets went up and actually went through the cab. Two guys, were on board. They were part of our team. They both survived, and apart from some very serious sandblasting, they both recovered, fully. But because of that incident, and my later studies as a mining engineer and working with explosives and initiation systems, I developed a very strong personal interest in understanding how these rockets functioned and how the initiation systems were developed and evolved over time. So the discussion points today, I'll just talk about the origins and development of the MRL. I'll talk about southern Angola and the theatre of war, and Tony's certainly opened up that discussion for us. The operational timeline for development and the implementation. A bit of a technical discussion, I won't spend a lot of time on it. The rocket range, ballistics and dispersion, I'll cover that because it's essential in understanding how that was used in practice when we were at places like Cahama and Kuvalai and Camaraderie. Operation Protea and how that informed Askari's MRL doctrine. So Protea is where we first used the rocket launchers, its very first initiation. And then what did we learn from Protea and take that into Askari. I will then just go through an actual operation, an actual Askari fire mission, so one that I was involved in, and I've discussed with various friends of mine, but there are such good notes on board now, and there's a lot of records that are available, and I've gone back in time and had a look at it, and I'll go through an actual fire mission with us. And then just Askari, how that shaped the doctrine for modular, hooper and packer, which came much later in time, and how things had kind of shifted by that point. And I'll also just very quickly go over an alternative playbook right at the very end from another army, another country's army, just to end things off. It's basically what it looks like in action. That's a rocket that's just leaving one of the tubes. So the origins and development, as was mentioned earlier, it was developed in response to the encounters with the Soviet BM-21 Grad system, which was being used by Fliers and the Cuban forces during Savannah. And as mentioned, Savannah was back in 1975. So after the devastating effectiveness of the BM-21, delivering its its very rapid saturating firepower, highlighted the need for a comparable capability within the South African Defence Force. International arms embargoes, we were all there, we all fully understood what the situation was. We weren't going to go and buy a multiple rocket launcher from anyone, so we had to develop it ourselves. So the development of the Valkiri began under Project Faro in 74, with engineering led by Arms Corps and the rocket development by what was then called SOMChem. The system was designed for rapid deployment, high volume fire and mobility, enabling shoot and scoot tactics, obviously to evade counter-battery fire. The first prototypes were completed by 1981 and the Valkyrie entered service with the Defence Force, debuting in Operation Protea. Just a very quick look at southern Angola. And the red lines indicate the actual pathways that SWAPO and Plan were trying to use to infiltrate into the northern part of Namibia. And this Lubongo, Cahama, Zenkongo and Jiva was one of those major routes that they were following and supporting Plan. The Kubango, Techmatet, Kuvalai and Jiva, another one. The east-west line coming down through Quito and Mavinga was also one that they tried to use quite intensively. Unfortunately, Jumba, we all know that that's the headquarters of UNITA, and the South African Defence Force spent a lot of time around Mavinga and Quito and actually, kept them away from that area in its entirety. So the operational timeline of the MRL. So Operation Protea, first operational deployment. Operation Askari in 83 and 84, major combat employment of the MRLs in support of deep area strikes. So this is where we really got into supporting the infantry and supporting the other units and divisions. 85, they were involved in Magneto and Weld Mesh, which were a series of actions that ultimately led into Wallpaper. And then 85, 86, Jerry and Abrasion, continued use of MRLs in interdiction and disruption roles. 86, Wallpaper and Alpha Centauri. I'm going to talk a bit more about those two shortly, because they are so significant with regards to an alternative use of the rocket launchers. 87, 88, obviously, the big ones around Quito, Quanavali, Modular, Hooper, and Packer. Displace, the MRLs were used again. This is coming towards the end of our time up in Angola, and they were used to support withdrawal and stabilization actions. And then Excite and Hilti, final operational use of the MRLs in the closing phase of the conflict. So what is the rocket launcher? It's a 127 mil self-propelled multiple rocket launcher, and it was first fielded on a Mercedes-Benz Unimog 4x4 chassis. There's a few photos of it coming up, but that was the configuration we used. There was a subsequent development, the variant, the Mark II, called the Bateleur. It was still a 127 millimeter, but it had a 40 tube pack on it, 2 sets of 20, and it was a remarkable vehicle. Just unfortunately was never available in time for us to use during the Angolan conflict. So the rockets are spin stabilized. They're fitted with high explosive fragmentation warheads, and they contain about 8,500 steel balls in each rocket. Each rocket produces a lethal footprint of about 1,500 square meters. The fusing options, we had a point detonation for ground burst, and we also had a proximity for air burst. I don't ever recall or know where we used the point detonation, all right? I know, we only ever used the proximity in my time, in my experience. There were so many other operations using the rocket launchers, and whether the direct action fuses were used, I'm not sure. So depending on the drag ring selection, and I'll explain that in a minute, the system offered an effective range of between 8 and 22 kilometers. The Valkyrie could deliver a full salvo in under 30 seconds, after which a manual reload took roughly 10 minutes. It was not a precision system. It wasn't designed to be a precision system. It was purpose-built for area saturation, delivering shock, disruption, and a psychological impact. And I talk quite a bit about that and how that evolved in our actual doctrine of how we use them. The warheads were optimized for anti-personnel effects and against soft-skinned vehicles. So armored vehicles, they were just balls, they just didn't penetrate. It was meant for quite the opposite. That's what the rocket looks like. You'll see up the front here, you've got a direct action or the proximity fuse on the front. The drag ring, and there's 3 options. Well, there's 4 options because there's 3 drag ring sizes plus a no drag ring. I will discuss that. You've got the warhead here, which had 8,500 5.56 mil ball bearings in each rocket. The motor itself was situated in this part of the rocket, and it used to burn for about 1.7 seconds. And with no drag ring, that would go up to almost 1,000 meters per second. Fully drag ringed, 870 odd meters per second. There was an umbilical for the electrical current and the initial spin. And then venturis for the, obviously escaping gases, it's a rocket, and providing thrust for the rocket. And then the unfolding fins for in-flight stability once the rocket was on its way. You'll see the center of gravity is in the forward third of the rocket. That's the same as you can imagine playing darts. A dart's exactly the same. It's because it's fin stabilized. Any effect of the wind would push it, in the direction that the wind would be coming from. So the center of gravity was forward. And then just, if you had a Valkiri battery of 8 launches, they could deliver 1.6 million ball bearings in approximately 24 seconds. So when a salvo is fired, the rockets land inside a big oval-shaped footprint on the ground. The further the distance fired, the wider the spread. So with a 120 mil drag ring, that's the shortest distance. That's the biggest drag ring, the most resistance, 7 to 9 kilometers. And the oval would be about 2 rugby fields wide and almost 1 rugby field deep. If you're firing with a full battery ripple, and a ripple is 8 rocket launches or 4 rocket launches if it's just one troop we're talking about, and every one of them fires the full ripple of 24, you're going to be getting 35 balls per square meter, all right? And you can understand the devastating effect that has on an area the size of 2 rugby fields wide and 1 rugby field depth. It's a devastating effect, albeit on soft targets. With the 105 mil drag ring, the distance increased to between 8 and 11.5 kilometers, 4 rugby fields placed side by side, 18 balls per square meter. We're going a further distance, and it's a greater dispersion. 87 mil drag ring, 9 to 15 kilometers, 6 rugby fields, 12 balls per square meter. No drag ring, which is where we could get up to the 22 kilometer range. A very wide dispersion, about 8 rugby fields wide, and down to 7 balls per square meter. Understanding that coverage density ultimately determines the number of rockets required to saturate the target. So, if we've got 4 rocket launches and we've got a full up, it's pointless firing all 24 rockets if the target dimensions or the criteria of that target don't warrant it. And those decisions were what we, had to assess all the time. That's just another photo. Having a look, so that rocket has left the tube. It's got that 1.7 milliseconds of burn time, and would, if not already at about 1,000 meters per second, very nearby to that speed. So just looking at the trajectory, the trajectory follows a typical ballistic arc. However, it's not a perfect parabola because, firstly, the rocket accelerates under thrust. So that first period there is different to what a projectile is coming out of a gun, because a projectile leaves and there's no further energy behind it. This has that thrust. It then transitions into pure ballistic flight, and then the aerodynamic drag and spin, the spin stabilization distort the ballistic arc further, so it has an unusual shape. You'll see here the direct action fuse just goes off on the ground. The proximity fuse goes off about 10 meters above surface, which generally in Angola is the tree canopy, due to the Doppler effect. So apologize if you guys all know what the Doppler effect is. I will just go through it very briefly. So inside the nose of the shell is a tiny radio transmitter. As the rocket flies, the fuse continuously sends out a steady radio wave. When the shell gets close to something, whether it's the ground, an aircraft, or a tree canopy, that transmitted radio wave starts bouncing back and back towards the receiver. So because the shell is moving at such a high speed, the reflected radio wave comes back with a slightly different frequency than the one transmitted, and that frequency difference is called the Doppler shift, which is what initiates the fuse to go off. So Operation Protea, 1981. So we launched Operation Protea to destroy SWAPO's headquarters and bases in southern Angola. So, for those involved, Onjiva and Zankongo were the big areas. It was the biggest operation since Savannah and involved effectively a brigade-sized formation. 2 task forces, Alpha and Bravo. And to give an idea of the proportions of this operation, the Air Force, the South African Air Force allocated 138 aircraft, of which 73 were combat aircraft. And that is a sizable amount of combat aircraft. Artillery, we had 1 medium battery. I just want to touch that I'm a gunner, and the way I've put this presentation together is based on the artillery. I fully understand there were a whole range of other elements around us in infantry and Panzer and everybody else. I will focus just on the infantry and more specifically on the rocket launchers' involvement. So we had a 1 medium battery which had the breech-loaded 140mm G2s. 4 medium battery had the same guns. 4-1 light battery had the 120mm mortars. And then an additional MRL troop operated as a come-as-you-are fire unit. Those were actually the instructions given. And had a mix of personnel drawn from the School of Artillery and from 4 Field Regiment. Very briefly, Protea, you'll see Zankongo there, Onjiva there. Those were the 2 major battles. H Troop supported Battle Group 10 in the attack on Humbe. And then what they did is they peeled off and provided support to the west of. Then 4 medium, 4-1 and 4-3 batteries supported battle groups 20, 30 and 40 in the attack on Zankongo. And this is where the MRL troop fires their first bombardment. And the reason I've got it up there is to show how we started off as part of the South African Defence Force. 4-3 battery supports the attack on Pew Pew after this stage was finished. 4-1 battery supports 3-2 with their attack on Mongua, and then 4 medium battery, 4-3 light battery, and the MRL troop supports the attack on Jiva. So the first bombardment, each MRL was commanded by a permanent force NCO. The entire leader element of this troop just completed the MRL training course at Art School in Potchefstroom. It was noted, and I actually went through the notes of this training course, and it was bloody interesting to understand what they were training to these guys at the time. But the instructors reiterated to the team that this would be the first time the MRL would be in use, and that lateral thinking will need to be utilized in the bush. And it was a learning curve for these guys. There was very little time. Potchefstroom shooting range is too small for rocket launchers, and the battle school was a long way away. And in 1981, these rocket launchers had just come off the production line. To make life interesting, the gunners had to use biffles as fire control posts. 288 rockets and fuses were carried, with 144 in reserve for Ops Protea. So the purpose in Ops Protea was to neutralize the entrenched SWAPO and FOPLA positions before the mechanized infantry advanced. The salvos provided shock and awe, breaking defensive morale and suppressing artillery. I'm going to just go through that in a bit more detail in a while. And they were particularly effective against the bunker complexes and troop concentrations around Zankongo and Onjiva. So the role in Protea, pre-assault bombardment. The Valkiri fired salvos to soften defences. They supported 6-1 mech and other defence units as units as they moved in, and the Valkiri fire missions suppressed enemy artillery and anti-aircraft positions. Psychological impact. This is the first time we came across it, and it became a significant part of the doctrine and development of the MRL usage in later operations. So the sheer volume of rockets caused disarray among defenders, contributing to the rapid collapse of resistance. The aftermath, with the Valkiri and the G2 guns, support for and the G2 guns support, South African Defence Force captured Zenkonga and Onjiva and severely disrupted SWAPO's operational capacity. You guys know about it. You know what how successful it was. So Operation Protea informed Askari's MRL doctrine. So we had to learn from what happened in Protea, and this is where myself and my group of guys came in, is that we were part of now learning from Protea and taking that into Askari. So one of the things we learned was rockets delivered overwhelming shock, but became wasteful when overused. So the lessons from Protea: Valkiri generated immediate shock and rapid collapse of SWAPO and FOPLA resistance. Literally, that was just one of the major parts of it. They frequently ended engagements before they fully developed. However, Protea also exposed key problems. Barrages were sustained for too long. Some missions were repeated without operational necessity. Ammunition expenditure escalated sharply. 210,000 rand per rocket in 1981. A full ripple, 192 rockets exceeded 40 million rand in value. So it was a devastating effect and a devastating input into the operation, but at a significant cost. How Operation Askari corrected this? So Askari's planners enforced a single salvo employment doctrine. Strict fire discipline across all batteries. Under this approach, the rockets were used to deliver the initial shock effect, shape the opening moments of the fight, not to sustain the engagement or to finish the battle. The psychological shock became a decisive effect. So the Protea insights: the enemy morale collapsed before significant physical damage occurred. Entire positions were abandoned after a single rocket strike. The eerie silence following a barrage triggered panic, but this effect was incidental, not planned. When it came to Askari, there was a deliberate application, so the shock was intentionally concentrated into seconds rather than minutes. A short violent burst followed by controlled silence. The silence after firing became a designed psychological weapon, not an accident. So rockets were employed at night, the pre-dawn window, and without any prior indicators. I will discuss that a bit. And this is all to maximize disorientation and exploit the enemy's fear response. Fixed firing positions inevitably attracted retaliation. So during Protea, the Valkiri batteries at times fired repeatedly from the same general areas, stayed in positions longer than was tactically safe, but however they did face limited country battery risk. But that threat was clearly increasing, and by the time we got to Askari, it was a different ballgame altogether. So Askari's corrective measures, shoot and scoot, became non-negotiable, and the new rules were enforced: single salvo only, immediate displacement after firing, and no repeat missions from the same ground. And what we had was multiple pre-surveyed firing sites prepared before the operation. Rockets were never meant to compete with artillery. So Protea fire planning, rockets, tube artillery, air power, they're all employed as just a general massed fire support. The effects overlapped rather than being integrated. There was no clear division of roles or sequencing. Askari's refinement: we had a deliberate separation of functions. The Valkiri, disruption, shock, and psychological paralysis. The G2s and G4s, I will explain what a G4 is shortly, precision destruction and sustained fire. The rockets delivered the opening blow, then immediately displaced. The infantry moved in to exploit the chaos created by the MRL strike, and this was a major doctrine moving forward. So the MRLs ceased functioning as big guns and instead became a battlefield initiator, and they shaped the fight before conventional artillery took over. It's just another view of the rocket launchers and what they look like with the tubes elevated. You'll see that the tubes are actually elevated directly above the cab. We did try and do that as often as we can because it allowed us to deploy a lot quicker, but most of the times we swung the cabs across. I'll explain that shortly. So learnings from Protea was that rockets can substitute for air power if employed at the right moment. This isn't meant to slag off anybody who's in the Air Force, and I believe there's one or two rows of people here in the Air Force. So the Protea experience was that the Valkiri barrages produced effects comparable to an airstrike. Air power was still planned as the primary strike option. The Askari adjustment was that the rockets were preferred in situations where the air defence threats were prohibitive, where political visibility made airstrikes undesirable, and under these conditions the Valkyrie effectively became a silent standoff airstrike. And they were independent of weather, daylight or surface-to-air missile threat. Targeting fixed positions offers the lowest return. So Protea targeting approach was placed on visible camps, trenches and known defensive lines. Delivered tactical success but produced limited operational payoff. Askari targeting evolution, the rockets were redirected toward headquarter nodes, reserve concentrations, artillery rear elements. So the focus shifted from geographic features to critical battlefield functions. So striking what mattered rather than what was merely visible. Rockets support disengagement as effectively as assault. So the Protea mindset, rockets were primarily employed to support offensive action, assist in seizing ground. The Askari insight, commanders recognized that rockets could also terminate an engagement rapidly, provide cover for withdrawal, deny or disrupt enemy pursuit, and these effects became especially valuable under the political constraints on escalation and the long, very vulnerable supply lines that we were using when we were up Cahama, Quito, and Kuvalai. Operation Askari, 83 to 84. I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but it was the largest mid-war offensive. The aim was to disrupt SWAPO and PLAN, their infiltration systems, and to weaken their regional command structure before that 84 rainy season started. Primary objectives included undermining PLAN's command, control and logistics network, reducing cross-border attacks into northern Namibia, and pressuring FOPLA to limit its support for PLAN forward bases. Destroying training camps, supply depots and infiltration routes. So it was quite a large-scale operation. And building on early operations like Protea and Dauphine, it's just Askari represented a significant expansion in scale, ambition, and the operational depth. And obviously we were targeting both guerrilla and conventional Angolan forces across a wide area. This is just a slide that a photograph of our troop during Ops Askari. There's a couple of gentlemen there that were good mates and still are. Dirk van Niekerk, Mark Davies. That tall fellow at the back there is a guy called Fred Wells, and you'll see how they pop up. I spent a very enjoyable lunch with Fred when I was in Cape Town last year, and just shows the bonds and how those relationships keep going. So the forces involved in Askari, the South African Defence Forces, 6-1 MEC, 3-2 Battalion, 4 SAI. The artillery elements were the G5s. Sorry, that's an error. It was only the G2s, sorry. The Valkiri MRLs and mortars. So error there, it was actually G2s and G4s. The Air Force aircraft providing reconnaissance and support. The opposing forces, PLAN and FOPLA, they had guerrilla formations, local militia units, the conventional Angolan brigades, and that formed a balanced combination of regular and irregular forces, and that shaped the defensive environment. Artillery support during Askari, and again I'm leaning towards the artillery gunner side of it. We had the 142 battery was the G4s. The G4 is an Israeli designed and built gun that we had, and they had given them to us and we were using them. The 127mm MRL troop, which from that time was from 4 Battalion Group. We had already moved to Middleburg, and that was Romeo Battery. The 140mm G2 battery from 6-1 Mech Organic Battery. This was Sierra Battery. They also had the 120mm mortars. There was a 4th battery, 7-2, from 7 Medium Regiment. So the area of operations, you know, it unfolded across a whole range of areas within Cahama area. So Cahama, it was a major Fopler-held town. I won't go through the details. Kuvalai was probably the most heavily defended objective in Askari. And once again, it contained the dense network of trenches, bunkers and minefields, which is what the MRL was designed to hammer. Kutev, it was a smaller but a strategically placed settlement, and that served as a fallback for anybody from Cahama or Kuvalai. This is just very briefly the battle plan. The challenges we had in Cahama was that they had the SAM service to air, the SAM-8 air defense system. It was one of our objectives was to capture it. We weren't successful at that stage. We got them later, but we didn't get them at this particular time. So because of the threat of the SAM-8, there was no light aircraft were allowed to fly. Angola is so flat, the tree height is identical. The only way we could see the targets was either if we had direct OPs or if we had somebody in the air. We weren't able to have any air support or any air observation for this strike. The strike aircraft were restricted to 60,000 feet, obviously due to the SAM-8 threat. There was a decision made to trial CORV system. I'm not sure if anyone's aware of that. It's a sound origin direction finder, and it was used by infantry for mortar locating. Another first was to deploy the Seeker unmanned air vehicle. These days we call them drones. It was fitted with an experimental GPS by CSIR, and it needed 18 torch batteries and 10 minutes for a fix. It was used, it did assist us. It was actually hit at one stage, but they did manage to fly it back to Zankongo. We hit Zankongo first, and then after Zankongo, the phase 2 of the attack was aimed up at towards Kutev. Mechanized attack by 6-1 Mech on Kutev, 2 combat teams supported by Sierra and Romeo batteries. Only after the attack on Kutev was a decision made to attack Cahama and capture the SAM-8s, which, as we understood, were on the surrounds on the southern and southeastern parameters of Cahama. Phase 4 was the movement from Kutev down to Cahama, and then the phase 4 was the full-blown mechanized attack on Cahama itself. This is an actual fire mission. This actually happened. It was sourced from after-action summaries and fellow veteran testimony. So a lot of guys have gone live on YouTube, documenting reports, using the official documentation, and there's a wealth of knowledge. And this is just one fire mission that we took part in, and I just want to go through it just to understand how the Valkiri was used. My own experience during this phase of the conflict also shapes part of the narrative that follows. So the operational context was Jan 84, location east-southeast of Cahama. Fopler Brigade elements were there with dug-in infantry, D-30 artillery, which is the Soviet-designed 122mm howitzer, and then this beast, which was the BM-21 Grad support, which is the Soviet-designed truck-mounted MRL. Now, this was a scary guy, and that's what they looked like. It was the BM-21 Grad that initiated our desire for that comparable technology back in 1975 in Ops Savannah. BM, Boyevaya Machina, which means combat vehicle. It's got, the 21 indicates that the launcher has 21 rocket tubes. And Grad means hail in Russian. And I just went through it in detail because the BM-21 was such a major part of everything that happened to us and dictated so much of our own MRL doctrine. Fortunately, we had these guys. This was the troop that I was involved in. Earlier, Tony, you mentioned Peter Page. I don't think you mentioned his name, but Peter Page is our troop commander, and that's that gentleman right there. That's me hiding behind Pete in the background. That's Fred Wells, I mentioned his name earlier. Mike Davies, Dirk van Niekerk. And this handsome-looking guy here is a gentleman called Perry Bass, who is a lifelong friend of mine. So our intent for this particular fire mission was prevent Fapla artillery from influencing the battle. We wanted to disrupt enemy command and logistic systems, and we wanted to allow our mechanized forces to maneuver without being drawn into extended artillery engagements. So the Valkyries were not employed to destroy Cahama. Objective was to paralyze the brigade rear areas, and creating that temporary window for our mechanized elements to reposition without interference. And the following slides illustrate the situation before, during and after the fire mission. T-40 and earlier, Recce and technical feasibility. And when I refer to Recce here, I'm not talking about the Recces, I'm talking about our internal troop reconnaissance team. So the Recce team identifies a firing area. We identified exit routes and post-fire hard. I'll explain why that's so critical to us. The Recce team consists of a Rattle, the commander, which in our case was Lieutenant Peter Page. And he had a Rattle, he had a driver, and he had a signaller, a radio guy in the Rattle with him. And then the second vehicle was a Biffle with the troop post officer, which was myself, and a surveyor, which was my friend Perry Bass, which we'll talk about in a bit. The objectives: we needed to confirm elevation constraints, whether we were going to fire over the cab, depending on the distance and range we were from the target, or whether we need to traverse to about 1,400 mils away from the direction of the cab in order for us to get a lower trajectory. We needed to establish survey stations with accurate orientation, and we needed to identify potential reload areas and ammunition hide positions. T-40 to T-30, intelligence queue and fire window. Reconnaissance and signal intelligence confirms that the enemy activity was there, and the target, and confirmed target validity. The fire window issued was pre-planned. There were no adjustment rounds. The G2 batteries were already laid on a secondary likely gun areas. T-30 to T-15, silent final preparation. The troop halts short of the firing area. The engines remain running. No radio traffic. The fire orders have already been disseminated. The crews conduct final checks on the elevation, azimuth, and the ripple sequence. And by this stage, the ammunition has been preloaded. T-15 to T-5. Occupy the firing positions. So the vehicles move into a staggered firing line and maintain spacing. I just want to explain how critical and how intense this part of the occupation was. So we had 4 rocket launchers. We had a Rattle, we had a Biffle, and we had these 4 rocket launchers. So we'd get close to this line that we were going to deploy these rocket launchers. The Rattle would head off basically in a right-hand direction to our exit point. And that would be a really good indication to show the rocket launchers where we were going to after the fire mission. The Biffle would then lead the 4 rocket launchers into this position. As we got into that position, the Biffle would stop, and the surveyor and the TPO would both jump out. All right. Now the surveyor's job was to get to his theodolite, which was set up. He would take the cover off, and he would check levels, and he would make sure that he's ready to go. The TPO would basically lead the rocket launchers along the face of where we needed them to be deployed. What we had done previously, we set up 2 markers, 2 steel pegs in the ground. Now, the reason for that was that's where the rocket launchers needed to pull in, front wheel, rear wheel, and that allowed them the 1,400 mils turn to as to where we were shooting. Every freaking number 1 on every rocket launcher wanted his pegs put in a different place and in a different shape, all right? So the job was to make sure you were putting the pegs out for each specific prima donna number 1 on each MRL, because they all like to come in in a certain way. And that was facilitated. But the action was that we would jump out of the Biffle. I would go ahead and stand at the point where the first rocket launcher would be deployed and show them the point. The minute I felt comfortable that they knew where they were going and what the angle was, I would start moving to the next one, to the position of the next rocket launcher. By that stage, rocket launcher number 2 was basically right up my behind, and we're at full gallop because the time in this position is very, very, very limited. We'd get the second rocket launcher, we'd deploy that, the third, the fourth. So, and we'd maintain spacing. If we felt there was going to be immediate retaliatory fire, we would space the rocket launchers out quite wide. If we didn't feel it was a massive threat, we would be closer. Generally, it was about 200 meters between rocket launchers. The launch rails were elevated to a preset angle. The time in the exposed position, we had to be in an open field. We couldn't do this from under trees, was kept under 10 minutes. T-5 to T-2, alignment and firing solution. So the survey station provides a common azimuth, bearing baseline. The theodolite measures angle to each launcher. The launchers rotate to match the firing bearing, and the elevation and range are set. And then the launchers use a paralleloscope for their own internal parallel sighting. So when rocket launcher number 1 gets into position, whilst we're running to rocket launcher number 2's position, the surveyor is already talking to rocket launcher number 1, who's got out, he's put his sights on, and he's already talking. By the time number 3 gets in place, surveyor's talking to number 2. It was a rapid deployment. So that's what we look like in the full position. You'll see the tubes are not over the cab. They've traversed away from the cab. I don't know if you can see in the background, the second rocket launcher is there. This was nice bush. I do think this photograph was taken at Luatla because in Angola, we really struggled to get such a nice open space as that. T-2, so the final command authority. So the troop commander confirms that he had fire when ready authority. All right. So he was talking to battery commander. Survey had to do radio because he could perhaps shout to rocket launcher number 1, but there's no ways he could hear him for 800 meters away. So we had to open up radio channels at that stage. Yes, 50 arcs needed to be clear. So although we were isolated, there wasn't anyone. These rockets send out a massive spray of sand-blasting material directly behind us. There's also a cap on the back of every rocket, and that flicks off, 100, 150 meters. So you had to make sure there was no one standing behind us. We had to make sure there's no observation aircraft. During Askari, that wasn't an issue because of the threat of the SAMs. And we had no adjustment rounds. So T-0, launch. All launches fire simultaneously. A full ripple leaves rails in under 30 seconds. The troop functions as a single massed fires weapon. So that noise you heard was the drag rings, the effect of the drag rings. If you didn't have drag rings on, we didn't have that. You would have noticed that's not the Valkiri, that's the Bateleur, and it's at Luatla. I used it because it did have the whining, which is so renowned as part of the multiple rocket launcher. The tubes itself are identical, the rocket's identical. That was 40, we only had 24.
Sorry, quick one. Notice all that smoke. Was that the dead giveaway for where you...
Immediate displacement for that very reason, because you had guys in observation posts, all right, and all they had to do was just a compass here, a compass there, triangulate our position, and they could direct 60 mil mortar fire on us almost immediately, and I'll discuss that. So the mission is complete once the last rocket leaves the rails. There was no assessment, no repeat unless pre-authorized. We never got pre-authorized. We never tried to repeat fire for obvious reasons. The crews remount instantly. They could fire the rocket remotely, or they could sit in the cab. Our guys always chose to sit in the cab, only because they could get back out, stabilizers up a lot quicker than if they were using the remote unit. My own personal reflection that this was the most intense part of the fire mission, as we were almost immediately hit with extensive retaliatory 60 mil fire. That's what hit us first, was the 60 mil. And when I say, you can imagine this 800 meters of area we were on. By the time rocket launch, so they would all leave at the same time, but the rocket launcher number 1, who was now the last to leave, when he was leaving the 800 meter paddock, the 60 mil mortars were accurate. They were landing right there. What they were then doing later on is they started preempting what our escape routes were going to be. So they had, they triangulate, but immediately at the same time, they had mortars angled at different dispersion lines that we had to follow. Not immediately, but soon after, both the BM21s and the D30s would also kick into action. But their response was more, just a guesswork, because by that stage we were well and truly gone and into our hide. Generally, we did not fire under a victor-victor threat. So, you guys all know victor-victor threat means that, there were enemy aircraft in the air, because you can imagine that smoke trail for any enemy aircraft would be a dead giveaway, and our smoke, our dust plumes as we leave in that area would be another dead giveaway. So we had to be critical that we couldn't fire during a victor-victor situation. So T plus 10 to T plus 30, secondary hide and exploitation. So the vehicles camouflaged, engines off, and the crews remain close. If enemy aircraft appear, the troop just remains concealed. So while the Valkyries are silent, the G2s and G4s conduct precision fire, the lateral groups advance, the enemy remains shaken, disorganized and uncertain. Another personal reflection for myself is that this was actually the best time of my time in the army, this half an hour. And I'll tell you, the reason is you can just imagine you've got, apart from Pete, who was probably in his 30s, you've got 6 or 8 or 10, 18-year-olds, and they've just been through this intense situation. Adrenaline's massive. Everybody's stuffed up here and there, or people have done things really well. And that's just that half an hour of that camaraderie and that discussion of what happened was just phenomenal. And we did it every time, and it was just purely the adrenaline that made us reflect on what we had just achieved. Just another view of what the MRLs look like. You'll see they've got the canvas covers on them. That is typical situation of what the Angolan bush looked like. And, because it was like that, you can understand why we needed to move into open areas to find firing positions. T30 and beyond, the reset cycle, the MRL Recce team. So we never stopped moving. So again, my own personal reflection of what we did after each op was, and all we had was maps, compass, and the vehicle odometer, so the biffle or the throttle. So the Recce team needed to identify a new reload area. So the guys in the MRLs are chilling now. They've shot their load. They've dispatched their rockets. They're all chilled and they're lying underneath the trees. What we have to do is we've got to go and find a new reload facility. So we go and identify another place. We find a suitable position. We go and pick up the ammunition echelon from the old echelon position, and we bring them to the new location. We then go back and pick up the MRLs. We bring them to the new reload facility. And once they're there, then everybody starts reloading depending on what the next potential fire mission will be, whether it's a ripple or whether it's 3 or 4 or 6 rockets that we were going to be firing. We did this 3-4 times a day. We did a lot of it at night as well, which made things extremely difficult. We did a lot of maneuvering at night without lights and with very limited radio usage as well. So it was very, very difficult. We were basically deadheading with compasses and odometers on bush bashing to get to positions. Yep. The guys in the rocket launchers were soft-skinned. They've got no protection. And even when I had the opportunity, because my role as a TPO, by the time the fire mission finished, I was on the other end of the things. I'd hop in the throttle. Then you're leaving and you're bashing it. You're trying to get out of there as quickly as you can. And one of the big jokes that we had was the guys in the throttle used to close the hatches because, even if 60mm mortar lands and you're not, it's not going to be disastrous. What happens is they land near and it's the splinters from the trees that that you just hear, whooshing through all the time. And one of the big challenges we had was the guys in the Unimogs used to call us a bunch of, softies, because we closed the hatches. And it came to a point where it was easier for us to leave the hatches up and just pretend we were brave because of that. So it was intense. With those 60mm mortars, they were close, and we experienced it all the time. Yep. When their OPs had seen us, because we're always leaving dust trails, we're always going to places. So at night and mornings, they had very similar doctrines to what we had, and they would very often have fire missions at certain areas. So yeah, we had the D30s and the BM21s. It was a constant artillery barrage. They were more I think they'd realised we were quite untouchable because we were so small and different and so mobile. So they really aimed a lot at the infantry and the bigger artillery guns. So I think we escaped a lot of the big gun fights because they were aimed at the big artillery and the infantry guys. They had Cuban and Russian support teams. They were directed well. The guys picked up. I wouldn't. I know we were extremely successful for a large part of the Angolan bush war. Towards the latter part, we struggled immensely because of politics and the fact that we had lost air supremacy. But I certainly don't see them as being cowboys in any form whatsoever. Yep. And, maybe that's why so many of us are still here today, because we did show them that reasonable level of respect, I think. Each battery was supported by a UNITA company. You'd have 2 or 3, the infantry platoons that were situated around us. So what the enemy experienced was a very loud tearing, roaring sound. You heard that at the latter part of that video. We had no warning shots, so they had no opportunity to get down. And 22 kilometers away, and the speed of these rockets was almost as quick as the speed of sound. So by the time the rockets were getting there, they had 1, 2, 3 seconds to react before the rockets were actually landing. It wasn't a simultaneous, they didn't have 20 seconds to react to it. Fragmentation was raining down over hundreds of meters. So several Foppler accounts later described the belief they were under air attack, the belief the multiple rocket batteries were firing, but in fact only one troop was involved. And this was generally observed in this case, and in general, as the moment that Foppler cohesion broke down, not necessarily the cause of MASH casualties. It was just that the morale breakdown. That's the inside cab. That's the old system that we used in Askari, and we still had when in modular and packer later on. I won't go through that in detail. I'm very conscious of time. So the firing sequence, what happens in the cab? So there's an electrical firing circuit. It is armed. The panel is switched from safe to armed. You saw that. The red fire switch is turned. So the ignition command is sent, and electrical pulse is sent to the first selected rocket's igniter. The rocket motor ignites, and the projectile leaves the tube under its own thrust. The system automatically steps to the next tube in the programmed sequence. The fire control system sequences the tubes to manage recoil forces and maintain stability. So it was essential that every time a rocket went off, the tube was back in its position. The sequence was as follows. So that's what this is looking from the rear. The thing with with the rocket is directly the opposite to a projectile. If the wind is blowing from the east, the projectile will head off to the west. With a rocket, it's exactly the opposite, because the wind catches the fins and moves it in direction. There was an example on the way from Protea up to Onjiva for Ops Protea, a rocket ammunition vehicle hit a landmine. All right, and it had 100 rockets on it, and they're in a wooden case, a long wooden case, the same length. But there were serious concerns that all the electronics had been desensitized in the rocket. All right, and they switched them off and said, we're not using those rockets, and they got the specialists up to investigate, and every single rocket was proven to be safe to use and ultimately used safely. And that showed the level of quality that was engineered into the rockets. So artillery neutralization without a duel. Instead of trading shells for hours, the Defence Force denied Fapla artillery a role altogether. Economy of force, 1 Valkyrie salvo, minimum ammunition, and outsized operational effect. So this is a summation of Askari. And this was vital given the supply lines, the political sensitivity, and the air defence threats. The Cuban doctrine was disrupted. And for those who know what the Cuban doctrine is, it's that the Soviet-style doctrine was that they needed to have identifiable gun lines. They wanted to know exactly where the opposition guns were. They wanted time to react to that threat, and they had a layered defence system. So they had different artillery units firing at different periods. And the Valkyrie denied all three. Psychological dominance, there's no ranging shots, no pattern to learn, and no warning. I just want to give a quick consideration, because we could talk about Askari and Quetta Carnivali, and those are the 2 battalion group level operations that we were involved in. We introduced the Protea, we talked about Protea and what we learned for Askari. I'll talk about what we learned from Askari and carried over to Quito, and all of these lessons that we learned, and we trained and used them at the Lata Army Battle School. However, the MRL was used by 3-2 Battalion in the Mavinga area during Wallpaper and Alpha Centauri and various other locations. And they followed a very unstructured but highly effective doctrine. Now, this is legendary stuff. As if you're a gunner, the stuff that the 3-2 Battalion did with these rocket launchers in and around this was before Packer and Hooper started. So the operations were not a single battle, and they were a defensive hub. So everything else, Quito and Askari, are offensive. This was very much defensive. They were used in a very specific, doctrinally consistent way. So it was used as shock artillery systems to break up Fapla Brigade level advances. So while Mavinga mattered, it was a gateway to Jamba, and the Defence Force needed to stop the advance north of Mavinga, ideally at the Lomba, the Lomba River. So, and the Valkyrie was deployed as a long-range disruption of bridge movement. 3-2 Battalion and Recce's identified targets, assembly areas, logistics, etc. And the Valkyries fired pre-planned saturation salvos on them. This is the absolutely brilliant part that fascinates us if you're a rocket launcher gunner, that they had one Land Rover, and that Land Rover had the commander in it, and he was on his own in that Land Rover. They had 2 MRLs. The first MRL had a crew member. The second person in the rocket launcher, in the cab with him, was the fire control officer, as well as the troop post officer. The second MRL had the 1 crew member, and the second person in the cab was the troop sergeant major. So we're talking a handful of guys who are carrying out this high level of destruction. And Wallpaper, I have some figures, it's a significant influence on the outcome of that part of the operation. When the scope of the Fapla advance had been appreciated, because there were 3 battalions in the area, 2 more MRLs were flown in. All in all, during Wallpaper, 37 fire missions were fired, and they used 3,240 rockets were consumed. All right, we're talking a handful of guys that did this. The effectiveness was that the Valkyrie was one of the decisive factors in stopping Fapla from ever reaching Mavinga. They never did. And this was one of the major stops to that. Just very briefly, we had to do a lot of our MET work ourselves. We had anemometer sitting on top of the biffle, which gave us the airspeed and direction on the ground. We then used a wind gun with projectile. We'd fire that up into the air. We'd basically measure the distance and direction that the projectile would land. That would give us the next level of wind speed and direction. And then the third level we had was we would shoot a balloon up into the air. We would track that with a theodolite, and that would give us the subsequent levels. Unfortunately for us, the rockets used to go through way more levels than that, and that's where the active MET we would get from our MET stations from other units within the Army. And that was an HP 41C calculator, which is what we did all our fire missions on. We used that. There was a program, and that's what we used. Askari, how Askari shaped the MRL doctrine for modular, Hooper, and Packer. Just a personal reflection. So we'd gone through Askari, and we'd been quite extensive use of the rocket launcher. Then from sort of 84 through to 88, we went to Lata Battle School, pretty much the same group of guys on 3 or 4 occasions, and we had used the MRLs on multiple occasions. When we got to Mavinga or Lundu, I forget where it was, we got what I thought was a very underwhelming transition training, in the sense that we had 3 or 4 brand new second lieutenants who were, in flashy, shiny brown uniforms, who tried to tell us how the doctrine had changed from Askari. And I call it underwhelming. It's not entirely fair, because there were some really good points that came up, but by and large, in my view, and how we subsequently used the MRLs during Operation Packer, which is the part of it that I was involved in, was very similar, if not identical, apart from a few changes which I'll go through. However, we were told that we had this overwhelming transition doctrine. So there were some good adjustments were made. The Valkiri shifted from a shock weapon to a battlefield shaping system. So Askari proved that MRLs were most effective before contact, not during it. Mobility and survivability were dramatically improved. I'm not sure how they felt we could escape any quicker than we were doing in Askari, because I was pretty keen for all of us to get out of there at that time. And the launches were dispersed to avoid counter-battery fire. Firing points were rotated frequently and pre-surveyed, and night movement was the key for us, because we could not move any vehicle during the daytime on Hooper, Packer, or modular, just purely because of the air threat. It would take a Mirage half an hour to get to the combat zone. It would have a few minutes active in that area, whereas FAPA could get aircraft there within 10 minutes, and they could have 30, 40 minutes in that area. They did have slightly superior aircraft to us as well. So our air superiority was well and truly done and dusted by modular, Packer, and Hooper. So integration of the G5 and G6s, we're in modular and Packer now, and we've got the G5s and G6s now. So Askari showed that Valkyrie and tube artillery were not yet synchronized, but by 87 and 88, the Valkyrie was used to open engagements with saturation fire. The G5, G6s then delivered the precision counter-battery attacks. Ammunition planning, and this was a very good move, and logistics were redesigned. So by 87 and 88, the dedicated MRL resupply echelons were created, whereas in Askari we're still very much, all right, well, let's help these guys out a bit as well. Ammo was pre-positioned along expected axis of advance, which helped us, the ammo vehicles weren't trundling back. So in the spare time and downtime, we would be running ammo through the night into predetermined locations. Targeting philosophy shifted from area denial to brigade disruption. I'll go through this quickly. It's not a big difference between what I feel we were utilizing quite successfully during Askari. By 87, Valkyrie was used to hit specific brigade elements. The goal was to fracture FAPLA brigade cohesion, not just cause casualties. In one of the opening slides, I spoke about what the South African Defence Force needed from a multiple rocket launcher, and I just want to discuss whether those objectives of from the Valkyrie were met. So they were meant to be a direct response to a battlefield threat, which, as we know, was the BM-21. So it was designed to counter the BM-21 and was successful in that way. It was rapid development and early deployment. Arms Corps and SOMChem developed the system quickly. 1975 to fully operational in 1981. I know at the break, one of the gentlemen was saying that what took us so long to only start in 1975, and it's a very valid point. Why did we wait until then to get going? Tactical effectiveness in the mobile bush war, it proved to be highly effective. It was fast, it was able to unleash full salvos in 30 seconds, and it mastered the shoot and scoot. Psychological and operational impact. During Askari, it became one of South African Defence Force's most feared weapons. So where the objectives met, further to that, locally tailored highly reliable system. It was built to meet the SADF operational needs. I struggle to try and remember a time the Unimog didn't work or any of the rocket firing systems didn't work. You know, it just was unbelievably reliable, the way and the timing of it. So what will the long-term legacy be? That the Valkiri MRL was one of the Defence Force's most successful indigenous weapon systems of the Angolan Bush War. It delivered high mobility, rapid, overwhelming firepower, significant psychological dominance, a reliable performance in austere conditions, and as we know, it was harsh conditions, we were resource limited, and it was unforgiving environment that we lived in. So I just wanted to look at an alternative playbook, and this is from another army, not ours, but just to go through the logic of it all. So their concept was that the MRL, the core concept was for massed shock effect rocket fire, which is pretty similar to us. Massed salvos, very short firing time. Theirs was shorter than ours, 7 to 10 seconds for a full battery. Psychological shock and a terrifying howl and huge blast pattern. So that was pretty much what we wanted. Area saturation was our doctrine, not precision fire. From an organisation perspective, it was grouped into regiments and brigades, very much the way we did it towards, you know, Askari and Hooper. It was held at army level, so the big boys were deciding on where these things moved. It was used as operational level firepower, not routine support. It had a shoot and scoot doctrine, rapid deployment, fire full salvo, immediate relocation. And its objective was for psychological shock and area saturation. From 1942 to 1975, we didn't learn a hell of a lot because we thought we were still reinventing the wheel. Very quickly, it's a site many people who crossed into Angola via road would you remember? Santa Clara, yeah. So Santa Clara, you go through there, and not far off you hit on Jiva, hook a bit of a left, and you head up towards in Congo, Cahama, and Kutev. You know, we just moved around all the time, and that's what it looked like. We obviously, you know, you can see we're all pretty relaxed there and not armoured in any way. So obviously it was a downtime or a safe area, probably way off any intense area at the time. That was a typical scene, just judging by the trees and that. I don't think this was in Angola. I think this was sort of back in northern Namibia, probably at Omatea or Ndangwa or something like that. Lieutenant Recce Richards, who you're looking at there, was probably one of the smallest of all of us. So yeah, that's a very good friend of mine, Perry Base, and he's sitting there with Kutev the chicken. Kutev the chicken was befriended in Kutev the town. Shortly after we had successfully occupied the region. You remember earlier how we went, you know, headed up and to Kutev before we turned and came back to Cahama. That's myself, that's yours truly, and Kutev, the chicken, and we're bonding in this particular photo. That's more bonding. However, they say war is hard in relationships, and yep, that was that was how this particular relationship ended. I did not kill the chicken. And I tried to eat it, but it fell in the sand before I could do that. But it's a very sad story. We didn't actually kill the chicken. I've had to explain it to Rick and to my grandkids, because they were quite devastated with that photo when they saw it. It wasn't us. The artillery adds a little colour to what would otherwise be known as a vulgar brawl. Frederick the Great. And, you know, for those who know me closely, I'm an avid Napoleon Bonaparte diehard. I'm an absolute love reading about Napoleon. I've read multiple books and studied him to a large extent, and this is one of his more famous sayings, that God fights on the side with the best artillery, and that's Napoleon Bonaparte. So that's it. Thank you very much, and if there is time for any more questions. Thank you.